June 24, 1941, Lithuania, the road to Raseiniai. The sun was rising. Over the dusty crossroads near the Dubysa River, the air smelled of pine needles and diesel exhaust. A column of German trucks from the 6th Panzer Division was moving north. They were part of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union. For 2 days, they had been slicing through the Red Army like a hot knife through butter. They were confident. They were arrogant. They believed the war would be over in weeks. Suddenly, the lead truck slammed on its brakes. Blocking the road ahead sat a single, solitary vehicle. It was enormous. It was painted a dark, menacing green. It sat squat and heavy on wide tracks. Its turret was a blocky, angular fortress of steel. The German truck driver honked his horn, thinking it was an abandoned Soviet tractor. The massive turret of the green monster began to rotate. The long barrel of a 76mm cannon leveled directly at the truck boom. The truck disintegrated. Fire engulfed the convoy. The Germans didn't panic immediately. They were professionals. They called up their anti-tank guns. A battery of 37mm PaK-36 guns, the standard German anti-tank weapon, was rushed forward. They set up in the ditch, 500 yards away. Fire. The commander ordered dot. The German gunners unleashed a volley. They watched the tracers streak toward the Soviet giant. They waited for the explosion. Clang, clang, clang. The shells hit the tank, and they bounced off. They ricocheted into the sky like sparks from an anvil. The Soviet tank didn't even move. It slowly turned its turret toward the anti-tank guns. Boom! One gun destroyed. Boom! A second gun destroyed. The Germans were stunned. They called for heavier weapons. They brought up a battery of 105mm field howitzers. The Soviet tank destroyed them too. For the next 24 hours, that single tank would sit at that crossroads. It would block the supply line for an entire German Panzer Division. It would absorb hundreds of hits. German soldiers would crawl up to it at night and place charges on its tracks, only to watch it shake them off. They would call in 88mm flak guns. They would call in airstrikes. The Germans called it the Russischer Colossus. They called the KV-2 the Dreadnought. But mostly, they called it a nightmare, because in June 1941, the German army realized a terrifying truth. They had invaded Russia, assuming they were fighting peasants with pitchforks. Instead, they had walked into a cage with a grizzly bear. This is the story of the Kliment Voroshilov tanks, the KV-1 and the KV-2. It is the story of the machines that were so tough, German shells simply shattered against them. It is the story of the Raseiniai incident, the greatest last stand of a single tank in history. And it is the story of how the arrogance of the V was broken against a wall of Soviet steel. To understand the shock of the KV tank, you have to understand what the German army thought they were fighting. In 1941, German intelligence on the Soviet Union was abysmally poor. It was blinded by racism and arrogance. The Nazi ideology taught that the Slavs were untermenschens. They believed that a society of inferior people could not possibly build sophisticated machines. Hitler famously said, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The German Panzer Divisions were equipped with the Panzer III and Panzer IV. These were good tanks. They had radios, good optics, and well-trained crews. But they were light. Their armor was only 30mm to 50mm thick. Their guns were 37mm or short-barreled 75mm. They were designed to fight other light tanks, like the French or British models. They had crushed in 1940. German intelligence reports estimated that the Soviet tank force consisted of thousands of obsolete T-226 and BT-7 light tanks. These were tin cans, fast, but with armor so thin a heavy machine gun could penetrate it. The Germans expected a turkey shoot, but hidden in the secret proving grounds of the U.S. Soviet engineers had been building something else. In 1939, during the Winter War with Finland, the Soviets realized their light tanks were vulnerable. They needed a breakthrough tank, a tank that could drive straight up to an enemy bunker, take a direct hit from an anti-tank gun, and keep driving. The design came from the Kirov plant in Leningrad. It was named after the People's Commissar for Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. The KV-THE specs were monstrous for 1939. Weight, 45 tons. A German Panzer III weighed 22 tons, armor 75 millimeters to 90 millimeters of hardened steel. Engine, a massive V12 diesel producing 500 horsepower. And then there was the KV-2. The Soviets wanted a tank that could destroy concrete bunkers. So they took the KV-1 hull and bolted a massive, boxy turret onto it. Inside, they mounted a 152 millimeters howitzer. The standard German tank gun was 37 millimeters. The KV-2 gun was 152 millimeters. It fired a shell that weighed 90 pounds. It looked ridiculous. It was 11 feet tall. It was top-heavy. If it fired while sitting on a slope, the recoil could tip the tank over, but it was impervious to everything the Germans had. The Germans didn't know it existed. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, the German panzers raced ahead, destroying thousands of obsolete Soviet light tanks. They were laughing. They were filming propaganda reels, and then they reached Raseiniai, June 23, 1941. Lithuania, the German 6th Panzer Division, commanded by Major General Franz Landgraf, was pushing toward the Dubysa River. Their objective was to seize the bridgeheads and open the road to Leningrad. Suddenly, their reconnaissance units reported contact with heavy enemy tanks. The Germans assumed this meant a platoon of T-26s. They sent forward a company of Panzer 35T tanks. These were Czech-built light tanks captured by the Germans. As the German tanks rounded a bend, they saw them. A line of green giants. The German commander ordered his tanks to fire. The 37mm shells hit the Soviet KVS. Clang. Clang. The German crews watched in horror as their shells simply disintegrated against the Soviet armor. They weren't even scratching the paint. Then the KVS returned fire. The 76mm gun of the KV-1 didn't bounce. It punched through the German tanks like they were made of cardboard. One hit, one kill. Turrets were blown off. Hulls were shattered. Panic set in. The German tanks reversed, firing wildly. They called for support. Send the 80. The 88mm flak gun was Germany's ace in the hole. Originally an anti-aircraft gun, it was the only weapon capable of killing heavy armor. A battery of 88s was set up on a ridge. They opened fire on the advancing KVS, but the KVS kept coming. One KV-1 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. It stopped for a moment, shook, and then started moving again. The crew was concussed, but the armor held. The Germans were seeing the KV shock, but the most legendary incident was about to happen a few miles away, while the main battle raged. A single KV-1 tank had driven behind the German lines. It parked itself at a vital crossroads near the village of Raseiniai. This was the only supply route for the northern spearhead of the 6th Panzer Division. This single tank cut the division in half. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel to the front were destroyed. Ambulances carrying wounded back to the rear were blocked. The Germans tried to drive around it. The tank swiveled its turret and destroyed them. It was a sniper in a fortress. General Landgraf was furious. It is one tank. He screamed at his officers. Remove it. He ordered an entire anti-tank battalion to engage the lone KV. For 50mm anti-tank guns were dragged into position. They were hidden in the bushes 600 yards away. For guns fired simultaneously. For hits, the German crews cheered. They waited for the smoke to clear as the dust settled. The turret of the KV slowly turned toward them. The Soviet tank hadn't been penetrated. It began to methodically pick off the German guns. One by one, it blasted them into scrap metal. The anti-tank battalion retreated. They had lost all their guns. The tank was still there. Nightfall, June 24, 1941. The lone KV-21 sat silent in the darkness. Inside, the crew was exhausted. They were out of fuel. They were low on ammunition. They knew they were surrounded, but they refused to surrender. The Germans decided to try a sneak attack. Pioneers. Combat engineers from the 57th Panzer Engineer Battalion crawled through the tall grass. They carried satchel charges bundles of high explosives. They reached the tank. They could hear the Soviet crew talking inside. Quietly, they placed the charges on the tracks and against the gun barrel. They lit the fuses and ran boom. The explosion shook the ground. The Germans waited. When the smoke cleared, the tracks were damaged. The gun barrel was scratched. but the hull was intact. The charges hadn't been strong enough to crack the armor. The tank's machine gun opened up, spraying the darkness. The engineers fled day 2, June 25, 1941. The Germans were getting desperate. An entire Panzer Division was stuck because of one tank. They were running out of ammo at the front. Because the trucks couldn't get past, they decided to use the ultimate weapon, the 88mm flak. But you can't just roll an 88mm gun up to a tank. It's a huge, heavy piece of artillery. It takes minutes to set up. If the tank sees you, you're dead. So the Germans created a distraction. They sent a wave of Panzer 35T tanks to attack the KV from the front. They knew their guns were useless. The Panzers were bait. They drove back and forth, firing their machine guns, trying to get the KV to turn its turret. It worked. The Soviet crew focused on the Panzers. While the tank was distracted, a German half-track towed an 88mm gun into position behind the tank. They were 700 yards away. The gun crew leveled the massive barrel. They loaded an armor-piercing shell. Fire. The first shot hit the KV in the rear of the turret. The second shot hit the hull. The third shot hit the turret ring. The tank stopped firing. Smoke began to drift from the hatches. The German soldiers cautiously approached. They climbed onto the hull. They knocked on the turret. No answer. They tried to open the hatch. It was locked suddenly. The turret began to rotate again. The tank wasn't dead. The crew was still alive. The 88mm shells had penetrated, but they hadn't killed everyone. The German soldiers on top of the tank screamed and jumped off. One German soldier had the presence of mind to shove a hand grenade through a hole made by one of the shells. The grenade exploded inside. The turret stopped moving. Finally, after 24 hours, the monster of Raseiniai was silent. When the Germans inspected the tank later, they found the bodies of 6 Soviet soldiers inside. They found that the tank had been hit over 70 times. Only 2 shots from the 88mm had penetrated. The Germans were so impressed by the bravery of the crew that they buried them with full military honors. General Erhard Raus, commander of the battle group, wrote in his diary, "This single tank blocked our supply route for 2 days. It destroyed our guns, our trucks, and our morale. We had to use an entire battery of 88s to kill it. If the Soviets have more of these, the war will be long and bloody." The incident at Raseiniai was not isolated. All along the Eastern Front, KVS were causing panic near Leningrad. A single KV-1 commanded by Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov set up an ambush. Kolobanov dug his tank into a hold-down position. He waited until a column of German tanks appeared. There were 43 German tanks. There was 1 Soviet tank. Kolobanov fired. He destroyed the lead tank, blocking the road. Then he destroyed the rear tank, trapping the column. For the next hour, Kolobanov picked them off one by one. The Germans fired back. They hit Kolobanov's tank 156 times. Not a single shell penetrated by the time the battle was over. Kolobanov had destroyed 22 German tanks in a single engagement. This terrified the German high command. In Berlin, they held emergency meetings. They set up a special commission called the Panzer Commission. They sent their best engineers to the front to examine captured KVs and T-34s. What they found shocked them. The German engineers noted the wide tracks. German tanks had narrow tracks. In the Russian mud and snow, they sank. The KV had massive wide tracks that distributed the weight. It could drive over soft snow where German tanks got stuck. They noted that diesel engine. German tanks ran on gasoline. Gasoline explodes easily. Diesel is harder to ignite. They noted the simplicity. German tanks were like Swiss watches, beautifully made but fragile. If you didn't change the oil every 500 miles, they broke. The KV was like a tractor. You could hit it with a sledgehammer and it would still run. This realization that the primitive Soviets had built a better tank forced Germany to completely redesign their panzer force. The result was the Tiger and the Panther. The Tiger tank was a direct response to the KV, the Germans said. "We need something with armor so thick the Russians can't hurt it, and a gun so big it can kill them from a mile away." In a way, the KV tank is the father of the Tiger tank. Without the shock of 1941, Germany might never have built their heavy cats. But if the KV was so invincible, Why did the Soviets lose so many of them? Because a tank is more than just armor and a gun. It is a system, and the KV had terrible flaws. Vision, the optics were terrible. The commander had a tiny slit to look through. He was effectively blind. German crews could sneak up on the flanks of a KV simply because the Soviet commander couldn't see them. Reliability, the transmission was a nightmare. It was designed for a 20-ton vehicle, but the KV weighed 45 tons. Drivers had to use a sledgehammer to shift gears. The clutches burned out constantly. More KVs were lost to mechanical breakdown than to enemy fire. Crew ergonomics, inside, it was cramped and loud. There was no radio in the early models. The commander had to signal the driver by kicking him in the shoulders. Left shoulder for left turn, right shoulder for right turn. And then there was the KV-2, the dreadnought. It was a terrifying weapon, but it was a tactical failure. It was so heavy, it collapsed bridges. It was so tall, it was an easy target for aircraft. And the turret was so heavy that if the tank was on a slope, the electric motor couldn't rotate it. The Soviets realized that invincible wasn't enough. They needed reliable. By 19... They began to phase out the KV-2. They modernized the KV-1 into the KV-1S speed, stripping some armor to make it faster. Eventually, the KV lineage evolved into the Izyashev-Stalin tanks. The IS-2, which appeared in 1944, was the ultimate evolution: reliable, reasonably fast, and carrying a massive 122mm gun that could blow the turret off a Tiger. The KV-1 and KV-2 were blunt instruments. They were crude. They were unreliable, but in 1941, they were the only thing standing between Hitler and Moscow. When the Red Army was collapsing, when millions of men were surrendering, the KVs stood firm. They were rallying points. A single KV could hold a bridge for a day. Buying precious time for the army to regroup, they bought time with their steel. The Battle of Raseiniai is remembered today not because it stopped the German invasion. Didn't the Germans eventually broke through? It is remembered because it broke the myth of German invincibility. Before Raseiniai, the Germans thought they were fighting subhumans. After Raseiniai, they knew they were fighting an enemy who could build monsters. The German soldiers who stood on top of that, burning KV at the crossroads, looking at the dents in the armor where their shells had bounced off, realized something that would haunt them for the next 4 years. This war was not going to be easy, and the road to Moscow was going to be paved with steel. This is forgotten thunder, the weapons they laughed at, the stories they forgot.